everyone, my name is Andy, welcome back to another FPL video, and today I'm going to talk about VAR, video assisted referees, and how it's going to affect the Premier League for the 2019-20 season. Obviously in Fantasy Premier League we talk a lot about penalty takers. If there's two players at the same price and one has penalties, then we'll often favour that player. The key question is, should we be looking for penalty takers and maybe even goalkeepers that have got a good record of saving penalties even more this year, because VAR is going to be introduced. So I've gone through some of the leagues it's been introduced to recently, as well as the World Cup, the 2018 World Cup. And at the end, I'll go through kind of my thoughts and opinions and whether I'm changing my strategy. So let's jump straight into it. So we'll look at the 2018 World Cup in Russia, and it's fair to say the penalties went up quite a bit. There was 29 awarded in 2018, with 76% of them being scored. In the previous three tournaments, 2014, 2010 and 2006, the highest amount of awarded penalties was 17, although the scoring rate does vary, and the same with the save rate as well. Exactly why this happened, I mean, VAR was the first big tournament it had been used in. Obviously, a lot of us who just watch the Premier League probably haven't seen how it works in other leagues. So it was the first time we had a proper experience with it in a big game setting. And I think the players probably had the same feeling. You know, any Premier League players that went, for example, wouldn't have used it before. And a lot of players from other leagues would be the same. And defenders, for example, have got away with like holding on to attackers for so long. I don't think they were expecting to get called up on it. So we saw a lot of holding from penalties being awarded, and obviously just general tackles that sometimes might not be given, but the referee was able to go back and give them. And of course it can work the other way. There'll be some tackles that in previous seasons would have been given, and then the referee goes and has a look and overturns them. So penalties can be given just as much as they can be taken away. And I do think World Cup's probably a little bit different to league play. Obviously it's the biggest tournament, everyone wants to do really well, and there's a lot of pressure because it's knockout style football, so any mistakes you make can be punished severely. And every player wants to get an edge, and that includes defenders against attackers. So it was a pretty big increase versus previous years or previous tournaments. So let's have a look at the leagues and see if the same thing happened. So we'll look at the Bundesliga first. Highlighted in green is the year when VAR was introduced. So it was introduced in the 2017-18 season. So they've used it for two full seasons now before this year. And obviously I've also shown you the 16-17 and 15-16 seasons as well. So in the year that it is introduced versus the year before, there was a pretty big decrease. There was 88 penalties given in VAR season and 97 the year before that. So it actually fell, possibly because too many penalties were being given. Possibly it's just a massive coincidence. If you look at the 2015-16 season, they'd actually increased slightly from there, and then continued to increase again last year to 91. So there's still a fair amount of penalties given. Again, the amount that's scored and the amounts that saves doesn't vary too much. I mean, there was only 9% saved last year, but in terms of being awarded, obviously that doesn't really affect things. So for the Bundesliga, it's slightly different to the World Cup. There was definitely a decrease straight away. That has gone back up again, but realistically, when you look at it compared to the other years, it hasn't changed a huge amount. We'll look at La Liga next, and really it was just a good excuse to use Messi in a video. Don't get to do that very often as a Fantasy Premier League run channel, but got to do it for this one. So in La Liga it's a little bit different. So it was only introduced last year. They didn't introduce it in 2017-18 like Bundesliga. It actually sharply increased, so 111 the year before, back in 17-18, and it went up to 129, so there was an additional 18 penalties given. And again, the amount that was scored didn't vary. It went from 73% all the way up to 82% for the 4 seasons I checked, and 16% to 24% for the amount of penalties that were saved. But that's a pretty big increase. Now, I've seen a few people say that La Liga is a bit more like the Premier League. It's kind of fast-paced. And that's why it was given. I don't know if there's too much to read into that. I don't think the Bundesliga and Serie are so far behind that we would see a penalty decrease just because of VAR. But maybe it's something to think about, that the Premier League might be more like La Liga than the other two leagues. But yeah, sharp increase. But again, if you go back a bit further, there was 120 given in 2016-17. So that's only an increase of 9. Which was already massively up versus 2015 and 16. There was actually an additional 26 penalties given in that year, and there was no VAR involved at all. So again, you can look at that and say, well, VAR was introduced, there was a massive uptick in penalties, but what was the reason between 2015-16 and then the next season, 16-17? So again, it's very hard to draw massive conclusions from this, but it does show that sometimes VAR can come in and increase pretty big. So last up we've got Serie A, and like Bundesliga, it was introduced in the 2017-18 season. And one thing I noticed first of all when researching this is there's a lot of penalties given in Serie A, and that has been the case all the way back to 2015-16. So there was 121 given then, Then the following season 136. But again, a bit like Bundesliga, it actually dropped the first season when they introduced VAR, went down to 119. And again, you could say VAR came in, it stopped a lot of penalties being given that shouldn't have been given in the first place. But then it went back up to 121, which is the same as the 2015-16 season when no VAR was being used. So we'll come on to conclusions in a sec, but looking at these kind of leagues outside of the World Cup, where we've really only got one tournament's worth of data. I mean, the World Cup will be more interesting when we go to the next one and the one after that and see if the same thing continues as players get used to it. But looking at this league, it's again hard to draw conclusions from it because, yes, it did sharply decrease, but then the year after it went to the same as the previous season back in 2015-16. So VAR wasn't introduced in one, it was being used in another. They had the same amount of penalties, so did it really make too much of a difference? So before I talk about my strategy for the FPL 2019-20 season and whether I'm going to target penalty takers even more, I thought I'd talk about a few things to note from what I've just gone through. So the percentage that's scored, missed and saved doesn't really vary that massively. It does vary season to season, but in terms of the gap between the percentages is not very high. So if VAR does give more penalties in the Premier League, then we'll see a few more scored, of course, and we'll also see a few more saved. So if you think VAR is going to increase, then you could target goalkeepers such as Pickford maybe that are good for penalty saves. And then good penalty takers like Aguero and players like that. There was an increase in La Liga in the World Cup. The World Cup had a pretty sharp increase, as did La Liga. But again, when you look back to previous seasons, especially in the leagues rather than the World Cup, it does start to even itself out whether VAR was being used or not. And the same thing with the Bundesliga. Yes, it decreased. And Serie A, but again, they did go up slightly afterwards as well. So I'm not sure VAR made too much of a difference there overall. One thing to note from the stats I've given you on penalties is that's over the course of the season. So there could be an increase at the start of the season as players get used to it. So we could see a bigger increase in penalties than we usually do, and then it might tail off as the league goes on. I think we saw that in the World Cup as well from memory. In the first couple of group games, we saw a lot of penalties being given, and of course we still saw some being given because of VAR into the tournament, but not as many. Obviously the games decrease, which help as well. But I think if you're going to get any more given, you'd think it'd be at the start of the season as defenders see what they can get away with in the box, and attackers maybe they want to see how easily they can go down, whether they're going to get caught. And stuff like that. So we could see an increase at the start. Not all penalty takers are equal. That's definitely worth remembering. So not every player that's necessarily on penalties is good at them. So as an example, I think I've given in other videos, I think Sigurdsson only scored 2 of 5 last year. Pogba scored quite a few, but he's also got that dodgy run-up, which never makes you feel safe that he's actually going to put a penalty away. And if you were like me, you had him at one point last year where he missed a penalty in like the 90th minute, which was super frustrating. On the other hand, players like Aguero and Salah are pretty good at penalties, and if especially Aguero, if he steps up and takes a penalty, or Kane, you'd expect it to go in. So again, if you think there's going to be an increase at the start of the season, maybe you want to target those penalty takers. And then similar for the goalkeepers, there are players like Pickford that I've mentioned that are pretty good at saving penalties, and maybe other ones like David De Gea that just aren't at all. So you're not going to necessarily want to go for penalty takers or savers and keepers, because they're not all equal. They're not all as good as each other at their respective jobs. And then do we need to change strategy? That is the big question for FPL. Am I starting to look at more penalty takers? And the answer, to be honest, is no. Like I said at the start, if there's 2 players that I consider in strongly, similar stats, similar fixtures, similar price, then I'll always pretty much favour the penalty taker because it's an additional way they can get goals. We saw last year that Mane did really well for non-penalty goals. He scored, I think, the same amount as Salah and as Aubameyang. Obviously, Salah did take some penalties. But at the end of the day, when it comes to FPL, it does not matter how that ball goes in the net. Whether it's a penalty, a 30-yard strike, a tap-in, you get the same amount of points for all of them. So, yes, I do like penalty takers. If we saw a defender with penalties, I'd absolutely have them in my team. Matt Ritchie might be one. But in terms of making a team full of VAR potential penalty takers, I'm not really looking to do it. Milivojevic, for example, is a really good penalty taker, but I don't want to rely on him for his price to get me penalties. I don't think Crystal Palace are necessarily going to get any more, especially if Zaha goes. So for me, I'm still looking into lots of different reasons of why I want to bring a player in. VAR is not really affecting my thinking at all, if I'm honest. When I look at the other leagues in the World Cup, yes, there's some that have gone up, there's some that have gone down, and ultimately I don't think you can read too much into it. The biggest thing for me is whether we'll see an increase at the start of the season, And given that we're going to early wildcard a lot of us, then maybe it's worth piling a few more penalty takers in for game week 1, especially when players like Kane have got Villa, Salah's got Norwich, and if Milner doesn't play, he'll be on penalties. So maybe you can think of it that way. But as a general rule, I'm not thinking about VAR at all. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are there other reasons why the penalties went up and down? Is it just VAR related? Are you going for penalty takers or not? If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like. Much appreciated as always, and subscribe. There's lots more content coming. There's lots more on the channel if you want to watch any of the videos I've already done. But subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when all those videos are going live. And leave me a comment below and let me know what you think of this video and kind of what players you're going for in your team. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for watching. As always, like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll see you soon.